In the park, two twins point at a billionaire magnate and catch the attention of their adoptive mother. "Look, Mom, that man looks just like us." She raises her eyes, intrigued, and simply cannot believe what she sees. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in golden hues, casting long shadows across the city park. Children's laughter echoed in the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant barking of dogs. Sophie adjusted her sunglasses, watching with a tired smile as her 5-year-old twins, Thomas and Claire, ran toward the swings. "Higher, Mom, I want to touch the sky," Claire shouted, her blonde braids flying in the wind. Sophie pushed the swings, taking turns between the two children. Her arms ached, but the sparkle in their eyes made every effort worthwhile. She observed their features, so similar yet so unique. Thomas's blue eyes glimmered with the same intensity as Claire's, but his hair was a few shades darker. After a few minutes, the kids jumped off the swings and ran toward the slide. Sophie followed them, her slow steps contrasting with their boundless energy. She sat on a nearby bench, taking a book from her bag, but her eyes barely skimmed the pages. She was always on alert, keeping an eye on every move the twins made. The park was starting to empty as twilight approached. Families gathered their belongings, calling reluctant children back home. Sophie checked her watch, calculating how much longer they could stay before dinner, and bath time became a race against the clock. That was when she noticed a figure approaching along the gravel path. A tall man, wearing a pristine suit that seemed out of place in the park's casual setting. His steps were purposeful, as though he had a specific goal, but his gaze drifted around the area, as if searching for something, or someone. A shiver ran inexplicably down Sophie's spine. Instinctively, she stood up, ready to call her children, but before she could open her mouth, Thomas's voice startled her. "Look, Claire, that man over there." Claire stopped midway down the slide, following her brother's pointing finger. Her eyes widened, an expression of surprise and curiosity crossing her little face. "Mom! Mom!" Claire called, hastily sliding down. "Look at that man over there. He looks just like us." Sophie frowned, confused. She turned slowly, following the children's gaze. The man in the suit was now standing just a few yards away, fiddling with his phone. When he raised his face, Sophie felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. The same piercing blue eyes, the same face shape, even the slight furrow of his brow when he was concentrating, was identical to the way Thomas looked when trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. "Mom, look, that man is the spitting image of us," Thomas exclaimed, tugging on Sophie's shirt. Sophie froze, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. It was as if time had stopped, the world around her disappearing as she stared at the stranger. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind, but not a single word escaped her lips. The man must have felt the weight of their stares, because he lifted his head from his phone. His eyes met Sophie's, and for a moment, it seemed like he, too, had been struck by lightning. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion, then to something Sophie couldn't decipher. Claire, always the bolder twin, took a step forward. "Hi, mister. You look like us." The man blinked as though emerging from a trance. He looked at Claire, then at Thomas, and finally back at Sophie. A hesitant smile began to form on his lips, but his eyes betrayed a mix of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and something deeper, almost painful. Sophie finally found her voice, though it sounded strange even to her own ears. "Thomas, Claire, let's go, it's getting late." "But Mom," Thomas began to protest. "Now." The firmness in her voice left no room for argument. Sophie took the children by the hand, throwing one last glance at the man before turning away. As they walked off, Sophie could feel the stranger's gaze burning into her back. She resisted the urge to look over her shoulder, focusing on keeping a steady, determined stride, but her mind was swirling. Who was that man? How could there be such a striking resemblance? And what did it mean for her and the children she loved more than life itself? The walk home had never felt so long. The twins' questions, "Mom, why didn't we talk to him? Could he be our uncle?" buzzed faintly in her ears. Sophie answered on autopilot, making vague promises of, "We'll talk about it later." When they finally got home, Sophie moved like an automaton, preparing dinner and overseeing the kids' bath time. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in the park over and over. The resemblance was undeniable, and the implications, she barely dared to consider them. Later, with the twins finally asleep, Sophie sat in the darkened kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. Should she call the adoption agency, a lawyer, or maybe... Her eyes fell on a photo of the twins on the fridge, their bright smiles frozen in time. Sophie felt a knot form in her throat. It didn't matter who that man was or what his appearance meant. Thomas and Claire were her children. She loved them, protected them, raised them. Nothing would change that. With a deep sigh, Sophie set the phone aside. Tomorrow would be another day. And for now, she needed to be strong. For them. For her family. As she prepared for bed, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change drastically. The encounter in the park was just the beginning, and for better or worse, she would face whatever came next. With one last glance at the twins' bedroom, Sophie closed her eyes and let sleep take her. But even in her dreams, a familiar pair of blue eyes haunted her, reminding her that some secrets cannot stay buried forever. The office was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional clink of coffee cups. Sophie sighed, rubbing her tired eyes as she stared at the stack of files on her desk. 6 years had passed, but the memory of that day was still vivid as if it were yesterday. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Sophie Lambert, Social Services," she answered, her professional tone masking her exhaustion. "Sophie, we've got a situation. Central Hospital. 2 newborns abandoned. I need you to take the case immediately." Sophie's heart sped up. In her 3 years as a social worker, she had handled dozens of tough cases, but something about this one made her sit up straight, suddenly on high alert. 30 minutes later, Sophie hurried into the hospital's neonatal unit. The head nurse greeted her with a grave look. "This way," she said, guiding Sophie to an isolated room. What Sophie saw upon entering made her heart clench. 2 tiny infants, a boy and a girl, slept peacefully in side-by-side incubators. They were impossibly small, fragile, and inexplicably beautiful. "They were found this morning at the emergency entrance," the nurse explained. "No identification, no clue about the parents, just this note." Sophie took the crumpled piece of paper. The shaky handwriting simply read, "Please take care of them. I can't." Swallowing hard, Sophie approached the incubators. The boy opened his eyes, a deep blue that seemed to see right into her soul. Beside him, the girl stirred, her tiny fist clenching as though she were ready to face the world. "Hey there, little ones," Sophie whispered, placing her hand on the incubator. "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Sophie dove headfirst into the case, working tirelessly to find the biological parents or any relatives who might claim the children. But every lead was a dead end. Meanwhile, she visited the twins daily. At first, she told herself it was merely part of her job, but soon she realized she was counting the hours until she could see them again. It was during one of those visits, 3 months after they were found, that Sophie made a decision that would change her life forever. She was holding the boy, whom she had secretly begun calling Thomas, against her chest. The girl, Claire in her mind, slept peacefully in the crib next to them. Suddenly, Thomas opened his eyes and smiled, his first real smile. Sophie's world stopped. In that moment, she knew these were her children. They always had been. The adoption process wasn't easy. There were doubts about her ability to raise twins alone, about her dedication to work, about 1,001 things. But Sophie fought tooth and nail. "They're already mine in my heart," she declared during the final hearing. "I'm only asking to make official what's already real." Finally, after months of anxiety and paperwork, Sophie took Thomas and Claire home. Her tiny 1-bedroom apartment had never felt so full of life and love. The first years were a roller coaster, sleepless nights blended with moments of pure joy. Sophie learned to change diapers with one hand while holding a bottle with the other. She sang off-key lullabies at 3 in the morning and celebrated every little milestone as though it were a miracle. There were challenges, of course. The occasional pitying look from strangers when they saw a single mother with twins. The innocent but painful questions from the children as they grew. Why don't we have a dad? Where did we come from? Sophie was always honest, within the limits of what the kids could understand. You came from my heart, she would say. And about a dad, well, some families are different. Ours is special just the way it is. But on quiet nights, after the children were asleep, Sophie couldn't help wondering, who were their biological parents? Why had they abandoned such perfect children? Would they ever appear, claiming what they had left behind? The fear of losing Thomas and Claire haunted her. Every birthday was both a celebration and a reminder that another year had passed without answers. Sophie carefully kept every photo, every drawing, every small souvenir. Sometimes, she found herself studying the children's faces, searching for clues about their origins. Thomas's blue eyes, so deep and expressive, Claire's mischievous smile, lighting up any room. As the twins grew, their unique personalities blossomed. Thomas was the thinker, always curious about how things worked. Claire was the adventurer, ready to explore every corner of the world. Together, they were a force of nature, and Sophie often wondered how she had been so lucky to be chosen as their mother. One night, just before the twins' 5th birthday, Sophie found Thomas awake, staring out the window. "What is it, my love?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Mom," he said in a small voice in the darkness, "do you think they think about us?" Sophie didn't need to ask who they were. Her heart clenched, but she kept her voice calm. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I know that, wherever they are, they must realize how loved you are." Thomas nodded, thoughtful. After a moment, he snuggled into Sophie's arms. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, my little one," Sophie whispered, kissing the top of his head. That night, lying in her bed, Sophie made a silent promise. No matter what the future held, she would protect Thomas and Claire with every fiber of her being. They were her world, her family, her everything. Little did she know that, in just a few days, a chance meeting in a park would change everything, bringing to light long-buried secrets and testing the bonds she had fought so hard to create. Sophie couldn't sleep that night. The image of the man in the park, with his striking resemblance to Thomas and Claire, tormented her thoughts. When the first rays of sun began filtering through the curtains, she was already seated at the kitchen table, laptop open, a cup of strong coffee by her side. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Where to start? She had no name, just a face and the memory of an expensive suit. Sophie hesitated, feeling like a stalker, but her need to know outweighed her discomfort. "Businessman, Central Park, Tuesday afternoon," she typed, aware it was a pointless search. As expected, thousands of irrelevant results popped up. Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. A noise from the kids' room made her quickly close the laptop. Minutes later, Thomas and Claire stumbled sleepily into the kitchen, hair tousled and eyes half closed. "Good morning, my loves," Sophie smiled, pushing her thoughts aside. "Who wants pancakes?" The day passed in a blur of school routines, work, and household chores. But whenever she had a free moment, Sophie's mind drifted back to the mystery man in the park. During her lunch break, locked in her office at the social services agency, she tried a different approach. "Local billionaire businessman," she typed, feeling ridiculous. To her surprise, a familiar face appeared among the results. Sophie's heart raced. It was definitely him. The same penetrating gaze, the same elegant bearing. The caption read, "Paul Devereaux, CEO of Devereaux Industries, at the annual conference." With trembling hands, Sophie clicked on the link. A flood of information filled the screen. Paul Devereaux, 42, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the area, known for his brilliant business mind and intense privacy. Few photos, even fewer personal details. Sophie combed through articles, interviews, anything that might hint at Paul's connection to the twins. But the more she read, the more frustrated she became. Paul Devereaux was an enigma, a man who seemed to exist only in the corporate world. One paragraph in particular caught her eye. Devereaux, notorious for his discretion, is rarely seen at social events. Sources close to him suggest he went through a personal crisis around 6 years ago, disappearing mysteriously for several months. 6 years, the same age as the twins. The phone rang, making Sophie jump. It was time for her next meeting. Reluctantly, she closed the search tabs, but her mind kept whirring. For the rest of the day, Sophie wrestled internally. What to do with this information? Confronting Paul directly seemed crazy, and if she was wrong, if she was right, the implications were overwhelming. On her way to pick up the kids from school, Sophie passed the main office of Devereaux Industries. The imposing building seemed to mock her, guarding secrets that might change her life forever. She parked, staring at the building's entrance. It would be so easy to walk in and ask to speak to Paul Devereaux. To say, "Hey, did you happen to abandon 2 babies 6 years ago?" Sophie shook her head, laughing bitterly at her own madness. No, she needed to be smarter, more careful. There was too much at stake. That night, after putting Thomas and Claire to bed, Sophie sat in the darkened living room, an untouched glass of wine before her. Possibilities swirled in her mind like a carousel spinning out of control. What if Paul really was their biological father? Would he want to be part of their lives? The idea of sharing Thomas and Claire, of potentially losing them, made her stomach turn. But then Sophie recalled the look in Paul's eyes at the park, the surprise, the confusion, that flicker of what? Recognition. Guilt. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was just as much a victim of circumstance as she was. Sophie picked up her phone, opening the photo gallery. Images of Thomas and Claire filled the screen, their smiles, their mischief, every precious moment of the last 5 years. They deserved to know the truth about their origins. They deserved the chance to meet their biological father, if it really was Paul. But what if the truth hurt them? What if Paul wanted nothing to do with them? Sophie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision on her shoulders. She was their mother, the only one they knew. It was her duty to protect them, but also to be honest. After hours of internal debate, Sophie reached a conclusion. She would investigate more quietly. She would try to find out more about Paul Devereaux, about what happened 6 years ago. And then, only then, decide if and how to approach the situation. With a deep sigh, Sophie stood up, determined. Tomorrow would be another day. She would visit the local library, look for archives of old newspapers. Maybe she would find something about Paul's personal crisis. As she got ready for bed, Sophie paused by the twins' room. Thomas and Claire slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm swirling around them. "I promise," Sophie whispered into the darkness, "I'll do what's best for you. Always." With that promise echoing in her heart, Sophie went to bed. Sleep came slowly, her mind still filled with unanswered questions. But one thing was certain. Her life as she knew it was about to change. And she needed to be ready for whatever lay ahead. In the silence of the night, Paul Devereaux's face lingered in her memories, a constant reminder of the mysterious past that now threatened her carefully built future. The afternoon sun painted the sky in golden tones as Sophie entered the park, her heart pounding against her chest. A week had passed since the unexpected encounter, a week of sleepless nights and anxious days. Today, she was determined to get answers. Thomas and Claire ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the air. Sophie watched them with a mixture of love and apprehension. Her eyes continuously scanned the park, searching for an expensive suit and a familiar pair of eyes. "Mum, look what I found," Claire shouted, holding up a particularly colorful leaf. Sophie smiled automatically, her thoughts torn between her children and the mission that had brought her there. "That's beautiful, honey. Why don't you find a few more so we can make a necklace?" While the children were busy with their little treasure hunt, Sophie sat on a bench, strategically placed. From there, she had a clear view of the main path where Paul had appeared the previous week. The minutes dragged on. Sophie checked her watch obsessively, wondering how long she should wait. What if he didn't show? What if it had all been a cruel coincidence? Just when she was about to give up, she saw him. Paul Devereaux was walking along the same gravel path, his flawless suit clashing with the park's casual vibe. Sophie felt the air leave her lungs. Summoning all her courage, she stood up. "Thomas, Claire, stay here and keep playing. Mom needs to talk to someone, okay?" The kids nodded distractedly. absorbed in their game. Sophie took a deep breath and walked toward Paul. He noticed her when she was just a few feet away. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, before it was replaced by a mask of neutrality. "Mr. Devereux," Sophie said, her voice steadier than she expected. Paul stopped, furrowing his brow slightly. "Yes, do we know each other?" Sophie hesitated, the words she had rehearsed so many times suddenly fleeing her mind. We saw you here last week. My children, they noticed a resemblance." Paul's face hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, but I think there's some mistake. I don't have children." The denial, though expected, hit Sophie like a punch. She drew a breath, determined not to back down. "Mr. Devereux, I know this might sound crazy, but my kids were abandoned almost 6 years ago, and they look incredibly like you." Paul averted his gaze, his posture stiff. For a moment, Sophie thought she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, but it was quickly suppressed. "Look, Miss Sophie Lambert." "Miss Lambert," Paul continued, his voice cold, "I understand you may be looking for answers, but I can assure you that I have no connection to your children. Now, if you'll excuse me." He made a move to walk away, but Sophie, driven by years of unanswered questions, stepped forward. "Please, Mr. Devereux, just look at them. Thomas has exactly your eyes, and Claire, her smile is identical to yours." Paul hesitated, his gaze involuntarily moving to where Thomas and Claire were playing. For a second, his mask of indifference slipped, and Sophie saw a mix of emotions cross his face: surprise, confusion, and something that looked painfully like recognition, but as quickly as it appeared, the emotion vanished. Paul composed himself, turning back to Sophie with a resolute expression. "Ms. Lambert, I'm sorry for the difficulties you and your children have faced. Truly, but I'm not the person you're looking for. Thousands of people have blue eyes and similar smiles. It's a coincidence, nothing more." Sophie felt tears of frustration forming in her eyes, but she held them back. "Mr. Devereux, I'm not asking for anything. I wanted you to know, to look at them. If there's any possibility." "There is no possibility," Paul interrupted, his voice gentler but still firm. "I have a life, Ms. Lambert, a company to run, responsibilities. I can't get involved in whatever this is." He paused, seeming to struggle internally. When he spoke again, his voice held a note almost like pleading. "Please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. For everyone's sake, it's better if we leave things as they are." Sophie wanted to scream, to demand a DNA test, to shake Paul until he admitted the truth she could see so clearly in his eyes. But she held herself back, aware of her children playing not far away. "All right, Mr. Devereux," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I understand. But if someday, if you ever change your mind, or if you just want to meet them, here's my card." She handed him a small business card, which Paul took after a moment's hesitation. "Goodbye, Mr. Devereux," Sophie said, turning to walk back to her children. "Miss Lambert," Paul's voice made her pause. When she turned, she saw a look of inner turmoil on his face. I hope you and your children have a happy life." Sophie nodded silently, unable to speak. She watched Paul walk away quickly, his rigid stride betraying the turmoil he tried to hide. Returning to the bench, Sophie sank down, watching Thomas and Claire play, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. She didn't know what to think. Paul's denial had been firm, but something in his eyes, in his reaction upon seeing the kids. Sophie sighed deeply. She hadn't gotten the answers she'd hoped for, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time she saw Paul Devereux. The twins' mystery was far from solved, and she had a feeling the revelations to come might change their lives forever. "Mom, can we go home?" Claire's voice pulled her back to reality. Sophie forced a smile. "Sure, honey. Let's go home." As they left the park, Sophie couldn't help looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see Paul watching them. But the path was empty, only the lengthening tree shadows marking the passing of time. With one last sigh, Sophie moved on, holding her children's hands. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She would do anything to protect Thomas and Claire, no matter what fate had in store. Paul Devereaux sat in his penthouse office, the city skyline stretching out before him through floor-to-ceiling windows. His eyes, however, were fixed on a small business card in his hand. Sophie Lambert. The name seemed to mock him, dredging up memories he had tried so hard to bury. With a frustrated grunt, he tossed the card into his desk drawer, slamming it shut. But even the familiar comfort of his corporate sanctuary couldn't calm the storm in his mind. The faces of the twins, Thomas and Claire, he remembered involuntarily, invaded his thoughts whenever he let his guard down. Those blue eyes, so much like his own. The little girl's smile, an exact replica of what he saw in the mirror every morning. "No," Paul murmured to himself, running his hands over his face. "It's impossible. It must be a coincidence." But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, a persistent voice in the back of his mind whispered the truth he refused to accept. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie delved deeper into her investigation. The local library became her second home in the weeks following her confrontation in the park. She spent hours combing through old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of Paul Devereaux. During one of those research sessions, Sophie made a startling discovery. A small article, almost hidden in the inner pages of a 6-year-old newspaper, caught her attention. Local magnate Paul Devereaux returns after mysterious absence. Close sources claim the CEO of Devereaux Industries spent the last few months on a journey of self-discovery. Devereaux declined to comment on rumors of a personal crisis. The article's date made Sophie's heart skip a beat. It was exactly 1 week after the day the twins were abandoned at the hospital. With trembling hands, she photocopied the article. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, forming a picture that was both thrilling and terrifying. In the following days, Sophie found herself watching Thomas and Claire with new eyes. Every mannerism, every expression seemed to scream the truth Paul had so vehemently denied. How had she not noticed before? The way Thomas furrowed his brow when concentrating, identical to Paul's expression in the park. Claire's melodious laugh, which Sophie now swore sounded like a child's version of the subdued laugh she'd heard from Paul. One night, while the children slept, Sophie allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if Paul accepted the truth. Would there be weekend visits, shared Christmases, or would he try to take the twins away from her? The fear and hope mingled in her heart, leaving her exhausted and confused. Paul, for his part, was fighting his own internal battle. He found himself driving by the park more often, always slowing down near the playground. His eyes anxiously scanned the area, part of him hoping to see Sophie and the twins, another part praying they wouldn't be there. On one of those occasions, he finally saw them. Thomas was on the swing, laughing as Sophie pushed him. Claire ran circles around them, her golden curls shining in the sun. Paul parked the car, watching from a distance. His heart ached in a way he couldn't explain. Long-buried memories began to resurface. The night 6 years ago, the bar, the sad-eyed woman with whom he had shared more than just drinks, the panic the next morning, the cowardly flight. Then, months later, the anonymous phone call that changed everything. "You have children," the voice had said. "Twins." They were abandoned at Central Hospital. Back then, Paul dismissed the call as a cruel prank, but now, faced with the living proof before his eyes, he could no longer deny the truth. With one final glance at the happy family in the park, Paul drove away, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to be part of that. He wanted to know his children, hear their laughter, see their smiles up close. But fear of responsibility, of change, of failing them as his own father had failed him, paralyzed him. Unaware of Paul's torment, Sophie continued her quest for answers. She managed to schedule an interview with a former employee of Devereaux Industries, hoping to glean more information about Paul's mysterious absence. The man, a middle-aged gentleman named Robert, met Sophie in a discreet cafe. "Ms. Lambert," he said, glancing around nervously, "I don't know exactly what happened back then, but I can tell you Mr. Devereaux came back. Changed. More withdrawn, colder, like he was carrying a huge burden." Sophie hung on every word, her heart pounding. And there was no mention of children or a woman. Robert shook his head. Nothing specific, but he hesitated, lowering his voice. There were rumors, whispers about a drunken night, a mysterious woman. Some even said he'd gone searching for a lost child. But of course, none of that was confirmed. Thanking Robert, Sophie left the cafe with her head spinning. Each new piece of information seemed to confirm her suspicions, but also raised more questions. Why would Paul deny his own children? What really happened 6 years ago? That night, lying in bed, Sophie made a decision. She could no longer live with these doubts. For everyone's peace of mind, hers, the twins, and even Paul's, she needed definitive answers. With renewed determination, Sophie began planning her next step. She would get the truth, no matter the cost. Thomas and Claire deserved to know where they came from, and she was determined to give them that. Meanwhile, across the city, Paul Devereaux lay awake, staring at an old photograph tucked away in the back of a drawer. It showed a young woman smiling, her eyes sparkling with unfulfilled promises. On the back, a single sentence was written: "For Paul, the night that changed everything." Fate was already in motion, weaving a complex web that would unite past and present. And at the center of that web were two innocent twins, oblivious to the unfolding drama, yet destined to be the catalyst for a long-buried truth. Paul Devereaux sat in his home office, an untouched glass of whiskey before him. The city lights twinkled outside, but his eyes were fixed on a faded photograph he held in trembling fingers. The image of a smiling woman stared back at him, her green eyes full of life and promise. He closed his eyes, allowing the memories he'd tried so hard to suppress to come rushing back. 6 years ago, the bar was crowded, the buzz of conversation and clinking glasses forming a familiar cacophony. Paul loosened his tie, feeling the weight of another stressful day on his shoulders. He rarely visited places like this, preferring the solitude of his penthouse, but that night something drew him in. That was when he saw her, sitting alone at the bar, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that hugged her curves. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "Is this seat taken?" Paul asked, gesturing to the stool beside her. She smiled, a smile that made his heart leap. "It is now." They talked for hours. Her name was Amélie. She was an art teacher in town for an exhibition, leaving the next morning. There was something in her eyes, a blend of sadness and hope, that completely captivated Paul. One drink led to another, and soon they were laughing like old friends. Paul found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about the pressure of running a corporate empire, about the loneliness at the top. "Sometimes," he confessed, "I just want to disappear, be someone else, even if just for one night." Amélie gently touched his hand. "Then do it. Tonight, you're not Paul Devereaux, the magnate. You're just Paul, a man at a bar." Her touch was electric. Before he knew it, they were at her place, a small rented studio filled with sketches and paints. What happened next was an explosion of passion and connection that Paul had never experienced before. The next morning, Paul woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The side of the bed where Amélie had slept was empty, but still warm. A note on the bedside table simply said, "Thank you for a magical night, A." Panic flooded Paul's chest. What had he done? He had an image to maintain, a company to run. He couldn't afford scandals or complications. With a heavy heart, but convinced he was doing the right thing, Paul dressed quickly and left, abandoning the one night of true freedom he had ever experienced. Back in the present, Paul opened his eyes, guilt and regret weighing him down like an anchor. He had never seen Amélie again after that night. He never knew their encounter had resulted in 2 innocent lives. The ring of his phone dragged him from his thoughts. It was his assistant. "Mr. Devereaux, sorry to bother you so late, but that woman, Sophie Lambert, is here in the lobby. She insists on speaking with you." Paul felt his stomach drop. "Tell her I'm on my way." As he rode the elevator down, Paul battled with himself. Part of him wanted to keep denying everything, to maintain the neat, controlled life he had built. But another part, a part that grew stronger every day, longed to meet those children, to be part of their lives. Sophie stood in the lobby, her stance determined but her eyes filled with anxiety. "Mr. Devereux," she said as soon as she saw him. "I know it's late, but we need to talk." Paul nodded silently, guiding her to an empty conference room. When the door closed behind them, the silence was heavy for a few moments. "I've done some research," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you were out of town when the twins were born. I know about the rumors of a personal crisis. Please, Mr. Devereux, Paul, I need to know the truth." Paul felt the weight of 6 years of denial and guilt pressing on his chest. He wanted to keep lying, to protect himself from the consequences of his actions. But looking into Sophie's eyes, seeing the mix of hope and fear, he knew he couldn't keep running. I didn't know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear I didn't know about the kids. If I had known..." Sophie let out a shaky breath, part relief, part shock. "So it's true. You're their father?" Paul nodded slowly, feeling as though the world was spinning around him. "There was one night. A woman. I never thought to... God, I don't even know her name." "Amélie," Sophie said softly. "That was on the twins' original birth certificate." The name hit Paul like a punch. Amélie, of course that was her name. How could he have forgotten? What happened to her? He found himself asking, dreading the answer. Sophie shook her head. "I don't know. She vanished after leaving the babies at the hospital. No one ever saw her again." Silence fell over them once more, heavy with the implications of what had just been revealed. "What do we do now?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely containing her emotion. Paul ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of a decision that would change lives forever. I don't know. I need time to process all this, to think about what's best for everyone." Sophie nodded, understanding, but Paul could see the worry in her eyes. "They're wonderful kids, Paul. Thomas has your intelligence, and Claire, well, she has your smile." Her words struck Paul deeply. Children. He had children. The reality began to settle in, bringing a mix of terror and a strange sense of joy he couldn't explain. "I promise," he said, looking directly into Sophie's eyes. "I won't just ignore this. I just need some time." Sophie stood, ready to leave. "All right, but Paul, they deserve to know the truth. And they deserve to meet their father." When Sophie left, Paul remained in the conference room alone, feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. The world he knew, the life he had so carefully constructed, was about to change irreversibly. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. There was a call he needed to make, a long overdue conversation he could no longer avoid. "Hello, Mom," he said when the call connected. "We need to talk. It's about my children." Meanwhile, across town, Sophie entered the twins' bedroom in silence. Thomas and Claire slept peacefully, unaware of the night's revelations. Sophie kissed their foreheads softly, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. "It's okay, my loves," she whispered. "Mommy will take care of everything." The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The truth, long buried, had finally surfaced, and its shockwaves were only beginning to spread. Paul Devereux's office, usually a symbol of power and control, felt stifling that morning. The glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the city now seemed like a transparent prison, exposing him to the outside world he had tried to keep at bay for so long. Sophie walked in, her posture a blend of determination and apprehension. Paul indicated a chair, unable to find the right words to begin this conversation that would change their lives. "Thank you for seeing me," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this isn't easy for any of us." Paul nodded, feeling the weight of 6 years of secrets pressing down on his shoulders. "Sophie, I owe you an explanation. And an apology." He stood, unable to stay still, and walked to the window. The city below went on with its routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding high in this skyscraper. "6 years ago," Paul began, his voice low yet firm, "I had a night that changed everything, though I didn't realize it at the time." Sophie listened attentively, her heart racing with each word. "I met a woman in a bar, Amélie. She was unlike anyone I'd ever known. For one night, I wasn't Paul Devereaux the magnate. I was just Paul, an ordinary man. He turned, facing Sophie with regret-filled eyes. It was just one night. The next morning, I ran. I went back to my life, my responsibilities, trying to forget. Sophie drew a deep breath, taking it all in. And you never saw her again? Paul shook his head. No, I didn't even know her last name. It was cowardly, I know, but at the time it felt like the right thing to do. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sophie finally broke it, her voice trembling but resolute. Paul, 6 years ago, I was a social worker. I got a case, 2 newborns abandoned at the hospital. Paul's eyes widened, the reality sinking in. Sophie went on, her words laden with emotion. A nurse found them at the emergency entrance. No identification, just a note that said, "Please take care of them." I can't. Paul felt his legs give way, bracing himself against the desk. My God, he whispered. I searched for months, Sophie said, tears forming in her eyes. I tried to find the parents, any relatives, but there was nothing. And then I fell in love with them. I couldn't leave them in the system. Paul looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and guilt shining in his gaze. You adopted them. Sophie nodded. They became my life, Paul. Thomas and Claire, they mean everything to me. The silence fell again, heavy with the implications of what had just been revealed. Paul, Sophie said softly, is there a possibility? Do you think you might be their father? The question hung in the air, laden with the potential to change lives forever. Paul closed his eyes, recalling the twins' faces in the park, Thomas's eyes, so much like his own. Claire's smile, an exact replica of his childhood grin. I think I am, he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. My God, Sophie, I have children. The realization hit him like a wave, making him stagger. Sophie quickly stood, guiding him back to his chair. This doesn't change anything for me, she said firmly. They are my children. I've raised them, loved them from the very beginning. Paul nodded, understanding the underlying fear in her words. I'm not here to take them from you, Sophie. I don't even know if I have the right to be part of their lives. They deserve to know the truth, Sophie said softly. And maybe they deserve a chance to meet their biological father. Paul looked at her, surprised by her generosity in such a complicated situation. How can we be sure? He asked. A DNA test, Sophie nodded. That would be best, for all of us, to be certain. Paul stood again, walking to the window. The city below looked different now, as though his entire world had shifted on its axis. What if it's true? He asked, more to himself than to Sophie. How do I explain to them? How do I make up for 6 years of absence? Sophie stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. One day at a time. Paul, if it's true, we'll figure this out together. For their sake. Paul turned, meeting Sophie's eyes filled with emotion. Thank you, he said simply, for taking care of them, for being the mother they deserved. Sophie offered a sad smile. They're amazing, Paul. Thomas has your intensity, your piercing gaze. And Claire, she's got your smile and your determination. Paul felt his heart clench at her words. Children. He had children. The enormity of it all was beginning to sink in. What do we do now? He asked, feeling lost for the first time in years. Sophie drew a deep breath. First, we take the test. Then, well, we'll have to tell them eventually. But carefully, in the right time. Paul agreed, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. I want to be part of their lives, Sophie. If they'll accept me, if you'll allow it. One step at a time, Sophie said gently. This is going to change all our lives. When Sophie left the office, Paul found himself alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the photo on his desk, showing a successful yet lonely businessman. That image now felt like it belonged to another life, another Paul. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone. There was a call he needed to make, a conversation long overdue. Mum? he said when the call was answered. "We need to talk. It's about my children." The future was uncertain, full of challenges and possibilities. But for the first time in years, Paul felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The lab was a sterile, impersonal place, its white walls and the antiseptic smell creating a tense atmosphere. Sophie held Thomas and Claire's hands, trying to maintain a reassuring smile while explaining they were going to take a special test. Paul stood a little way off, visibly uncomfortable with every restless movement. "Will it hurt, Mom?" Thomas asked, his big blue eyes so much like Paul's, wide with apprehension. Sophie gently ruffled his hair. "No, sweetheart, it's just a swab on your cheek, like brushing your teeth, but quicker." Claire, ever the bravest, stepped up. "I'll go first," she announced, looking curiously at Paul. The lab technician, a kind, middle-aged man, smiled at the kids. "Who wants to pick out a sticker afterward?" As the children were tested, Sophie and Paul exchanged looks loaded with emotion. This seemingly simple moment had the power to change their lives forever. When it was Paul's turn, he hesitated briefly before opening his mouth for the swab. The weight of his past actions, and the responsibility he might soon assume, collided in that single instant. "How long until we have the results?" Sophie asked the technician, her voice betraying her anxiety. "It usually takes about a week," he replied. "We'll contact you as soon as they're ready." A week, 7 days that would feel like an eternity. As they left the lab, Paul turned to Sophie. Can I call to check on them during the week?" Sophie nodded, seeing the mixture of fear and hope in his eyes. "Of course. They'll probably have questions about you too." The following days were an emotional whirlwind for both of them. Sophie caught herself observing the twins even more closely, looking for Paul in every gesture and expression. The possibility of a massive family change left her oscillating between hope and dread. One night, as the children slept, Sophie allowed herself to weep silently in the kitchen. What if the results were positive? Would Paul try to take custody? What if they were negative? Paul's disappointment would be almost as painful as their current uncertainty. Paul, in turn, threw himself into work by day, trying to distract himself from the agonizing weight. But at night, alone in his luxurious apartment, he found himself looking at old photos from his own childhood, searching for any similarity to Thomas and Claire. He called Sophie almost every day, anxious for news, for any detail about the kids. "Claire won a drawing contest at school," Sophie mentioned in one call, "and Thomas is obsessed with a new dinosaur book." Paul soaked up every word, feeling a mix of pride and sadness for all the moments he had missed. On the 4th day of waiting, Paul had a vivid dream. He was in a sunny park, pushing Thomas and Claire on swings. Their laughter filled the air, and Paul felt a pure joy he had never known. When he woke up, his pillow was damp with tears he hadn't realized he'd shed. Sophie, meanwhile, wrestled with her own fears and insecurities. One night, after tucking the children in, she sat alone in the dark, mentally replaying the twins' major milestones. First smile, first steps, first words. She had been there for all of it. Paul had not. How would that affect their relationship with him if the results came back positive? On the 6th day, tension reached its peak. Paul called Sophie in the middle of the day, his voice taut. "I don't know if I can wait any longer," he confessed. "What if I'm not their father? Or worse, what if I am?" Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own doubts. "Paul, no matter what the results say, Thomas and Claire are amazing children. And they deserve all the love they can get, whoever it comes from." Her words seemed to calm Paul, and for a moment they shared a deep connection, united by their concern for the kids' well-being. On the morning of the 7th day, Sophie's phone rang. It was the lab. The results were ready. With trembling hands, she called Paul. "They want us to come pick up the results in person," she said, her voice barely hiding her nerves. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Paul replied, already grabbing his keys. The drive to the lab was filled with tense silence. Paul focused on the road, while Sophie stared out the window, her mind awash with possibilities. Upon arrival, they were greeted by the same gentle technician from the week before. He led them to a private room, holding a sealed envelope in his hands. "The results are here," he said, placing the envelope on the table between Sophie and Paul. "Would you like a moment alone to open it?" They both nodded, speechless. When the door closed behind the technician, Sophie and Paul looked at each other, the envelope between them feeling like it weighed a ton. "Together?" Paul asked softly. Sophie nodded, reaching for the envelope. With trembling fingers, she opened it and unfolded the paper inside. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Sophie read the words once, twice, 3 times, making sure she understood correctly. Finally, she lifted her eyes to meet Paul's anxious gaze. "Paul," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're the father." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Paul felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. A father. He was a father. To Thomas and Claire, it was real. Sophie saw a whirlwind of emotions flash across Paul's face. Shock, joy, fear, hope. "What do we do now?" Paul asked, his voice husky with emotion. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility they now shared. "Now," she said softly, "we tell them, and we start building a new reality. Together." As they left the lab side by side, both knew their lives would never be the same. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and possibilities, but one thing was clear. Thomas and Claire now had not only a devoted mother, but also a father eager to know and love them. The real challenge was only just beginning. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Sophie's living room, creating dancing patterns on the rug, where Thomas and Claire played happily, unaware of the tension in the air. Sophie and Paul sat on the couch, exchanging nervous glances, the DNA test envelope between them like a ticking time bomb. "How are we going to tell them?" Paul whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "With honesty and love," she replied, though her own voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Kids," Sophie called gently, "could you come here for a moment? Mommy and Paul need to talk to you." Thomas and Claire stood up, curiosity shining on their little faces. They sat down on the floor in front of the adults, waiting expectantly. "Do you remember that special test we did last week?" Sophie began, her tone warm. The twins nodded, Claire tilting her head, a gesture Paul immediately recognized as his own. "Well," Sophie continued, "that test was to find out something very important, something about your family." Thomas's brow furrowed, his expression serious. "About our other mom?" Sophie felt her heart tighten. They had talked about adoption before, but never so directly. "Actually," Paul interjected, his voice surprisingly firm, "it was about your dad." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. "We have a dad?" Claire asked, her blue eyes widening with surprise. Paul felt tears welling in his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, you do have a dad. And it's me." Their reactions were immediate and varied. Thomas looked stunned, his gaze moving between Paul and Sophie for confirmation. Claire, on the other hand, squealed with joy and jumped, throwing herself into Paul's arms. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "I knew you looked like us." Paul held her tight, tears rolling freely down his cheeks now. The sweet smell of Claire's shampoo, the feel of her little arms around his neck, everything was overwhelming. Thomas, always the cautious one, stayed where he was, looking at Sophie. "Mum," he asked, his voice small and unsure. Sophie opened her arms, and Thomas ran to her, burying his face in her chest. "It's okay, my love," she whispered, stroking his hair. "This doesn't change how much I love you. It just means you have one more person to love you now." Paul looked at Sophie over Claire's head, a mixture of gratitude and admiration in his eyes. He extended a hand toward Thomas, who was still in Sophie's arms. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "I know this is a surprise, and I understand if you need time to get used to it. But I want you to know I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Thomas glanced at Paul's outstretched hand, then at his mother's face. Seeing Sophie's reassuring smile, he slowly reached out his own small hand, allowing Paul to hold it. The moment was interrupted by Claire, who suddenly sat up in Paul's lap, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Wait!" Does this mean we can have 2 birthdays now? Her innocent question broke the tension, making them all laugh. Paul hugged Claire tighter, marveling at her ability to see the bright side of everything. Not exactly, Princess, he chuckled, but I promise we'll make up for every celebration we've missed. As the afternoon wore on, the children bombarded Paul with questions. Where did he live? Did he have a dog? Could he make pancakes? Paul answered each one patiently, his heart filling with love at each interaction. Sophie watched it all with a complex mix of emotions, joy at seeing the children so happy, relief that Paul was handling everything so well, and a tinge of apprehension about what the future held. When it was finally time for the children to go to bed, Paul seemed reluctant to leave. Could I read them a story? He asked Sophie, almost shyly. Sophie nodded, offering a small smile. Sure, they'd love that. As Paul followed the excited kids to their bedroom, Sophie took a moment in the kitchen to reflect. She could hear Paul's low voice reading, "Where the Wild Things Are," occasionally interrupted by the twins' giggles. 20 minutes later, Paul returned to the living room, looking emotionally drained but radiant. "They're incredible, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've done an amazing job with them." Sophie smiled, feeling a wave of pride. "They are, aren't they? And now they have you, too." Paul's smile faltered a bit. "Sophie, I want to be part of their lives, truly. Not just occasional visits or birthday gifts. I want to be there for the day-to-day, the big and small moments." Sophie felt her heart race. It was what she both feared and hoped for at the same time. "Paul, I understand, and I want you to be part of their lives, but we have to think about what's best for the children. We can't just flip their world upside down overnight." Paul nodded, running his hand through his hair in frustration. I know. It's just, I feel like I've already missed so much time." Sophie stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We have time now, Paul. Let's do this right for them." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, regular visits, family dinners, maybe even weekend trips. Paul mentioned the idea of buying a house in the same neighborhood to be closer. "What about your company?" Sophie asked. "How will this affect your professional life?" Paul shrugged, an ironic smile on his lips. "Honestly, I don't care. For the first time in my life, I have something more important than business to worry about." When Paul finally left, there was a new energy between them, a shared sense of purpose. "Thank you, Sophie," Paul said at the door, "for being so understanding, for taking such good care of them all these years. I can never make up for lost time, but I promise I'll do everything I can for them, for all of you." Sophie nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. "Good night, Paul. See you soon." As she watched Paul drive away, Sophie allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Tears she had held back all day finally slid down her cheeks, tears of relief, fear, and hope. The future was uncertain, but one thing was sure. Their lives would never be the same again. And perhaps, just maybe, that was a good thing. Sophie closed the door, returning to the stillness of her home. In the kids' room, she could hear Thomas's soft snores and Claire's occasional sleepy murmurs. Her family, one that was now a bit bigger, a bit more complicated, but infinitely richer. With a deep sigh, Sophie prepared for bed, knowing the days ahead would be filled with challenges, adjustments, and hopefully a lot of joy. The journey was just beginning. The park was full of laughter and excited shouts of children on that sunny Saturday morning. Paul arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. It was his first day alone with the twins, without Sophie's reassuring presence. He spotted Thomas and Claire running toward him, Sophie following behind with a cautious smile. "Paul, Paul!" Claire shouted, throwing herself into his arms without hesitation. Thomas, always more reserved, approached with a small smile. "Hey, buddy," Paul said, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Ready for a day of adventure?" Sophie approached, adjusting the kid's backpack. "There's sunscreen, snacks, and water in there," she explained. "Thomas is allergic to peanuts, so be careful what they eat. And Claire sometimes gets dizzy on very fast rides. So, Sophie, Paul interrupted gently. "It'll be okay. I promise I'll take good care of them." She nodded, biting her lip. I know. It's the first time I've been away from them this long since ever." Paul felt a pang of guilt, but tried to stay optimistic. "They're going to have a great time, and they'll be back before you know it." After a few more instructions and many hugs, Sophie finally walked off, throwing glances over her shoulder. Paul took a deep breath, turning to the kids with an enthusiastic grin. "So where do we start?" The next few hours were an emotional roller coaster for Paul. He discovered Claire was fearless, always ready for the next challenge, while Thomas preferred to observe before diving in. On the carousel, Paul held Claire tightly as she waved happily, then helped Thomas pick the safest horse. "Look, Paul!" Claire shouted from atop the slide. "I'm flying!" Paul felt his heart leap into his throat, but kept a supportive smile. "Careful, princess, go down slowly." Thomas sat beside Paul on a nearby bench, watching everything with thoughtful eyes. "Are you going to stay with us forever now?" he asked suddenly. Paul felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." The boy nodded seriously. "Good. But you're not going to take us away from Mum, right?" "Never," Paul promised, pulling Thomas into a hug. "Your mum is amazing, and you three are a package deal. I'm here to join the family, not break it up." Lunch was a chaotic affair, with Paul trying to keep the kids clean while they devoured sandwiches and fruit. He found himself laughing more than he had in years. Meanwhile, Sophie was having what felt like the longest day of her life. Each minute dragged by, and she checked her phone obsessively, hoping for updates. Determined to distract herself, she started reorganizing the children's bedroom. While straightening a shelf, a photo slipped from the album. It was a picture of her in the hospital with the newborn twins. Sophie sat on the bed staring at it, recalling the fear and joy of those early days. "Did I do the right thing?" she whispered to herself. "They're still mine, aren't they?" Back at the park, Paul was quickly learning the complexities of fatherhood. When Claire tripped and scraped her knee, he panicked momentarily before remembering the first aid kit in the backpack. "That's okay, princess," he murmured, cleaning the wound gently. "You're strong as a lioness, remember?" Claire sniffled, but then gave a brave smile. "Like a lioness," she repeated. Thomas, watching closely, commented, "Mom always says kisses make it better." Thomas, watching closely, remarked, "Mom always says kisses make it better." Paul hesitated for a second, then placed a gentle kiss on Claire's scraped knee. "Better now." "Much better," Claire exclaimed, hopping up and running back to play. As the afternoon wore on, Paul found himself growing more comfortable in his new role. He discovered that Thomas loved dinosaurs and promised to take him to the Natural History Museum. He learned that Claire dreamed of becoming an astronaut and vowed to build a cardboard rocket with her the following weekend. When it was finally time to leave, Paul found himself surprisingly sad that the day was ending. Sophie was waiting anxiously by the door when they arrived home. Her face lit up at the sight of the children racing toward her, covered in dirt and grinning from ear to ear. "Mom, it was the best day," Claire squealed, throwing herself into Sophie's arms. "Paul took us on the carousel 3 times, Thomas added, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Sophie glanced at Paul, who looked exhausted but radiant. "Sounds like you all had fun," she commented with a tentative smile. Paul nodded, running a hand through his mussed hair. "They're amazing, Sophie. Thank you for letting me do this." After the kids went in to wash up, Paul and Sophie lingered on the porch, a comfortable silence settling between them. "You've done an incredible job with them," Paul said softly. I wish I'd been here from the start." Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. "They really liked you, Paul." "It's obvious." "That doesn't lessen what you mean to them," he quickly reassured her. "You're their mom, Sophie. You always will be." She nodded, wiping away a stubborn tear. "I know. It's just... it can be hard to share sometimes." Paul placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're all learning. But I think we can make this work, for their sake." Sophie smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Yes, I think we can." When Paul said his goodbyes, promising to return the next day for a family dinner, Sophie felt a jumble of emotions. There was fear of the unknown, yes, but also a growing sense of hope. Perhaps, just maybe, this new dynamic could bring something beautiful for them all. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Sophie listened to their animated stories about their day with Paul. Their excitement was unmistakable. "Mom," Thomas said sleepily, "it's nice having a dad and a mom, isn't it?" Sophie kissed his forehead, feeling her heart swell. "Yes, my love, it really is." Later, lying in her own bed, Sophie reflected on the day. Things were changing. Yes, but maybe for the better. Her family wasn't shrinking, it was growing. And with that comforting thought, she fell asleep, dreaming of sunny days at the park and the sound of happy children's laughter. The private investigator's office was cluttered with files, and the stale smell of old coffee lingered in the air. Sophie and Paul sat awkwardly in worn-out chairs, waiting anxiously for news that could change their lives yet again. "I found her," the detective, a middle-aged man named Mike, announced bluntly. "Anne Dubois. It wasn't easy, but I managed to track her down." Sophie felt her heart race. After weeks of searching, they finally had answers about the twins' birth mother. "Where is she?" Paul asked, his voice tight. Mike slid a folder across the desk. "Living under the name Sarah Thompson in a small coastal town about 100 miles from here. She works as an art teacher at a local school." Sophie opened the folder with trembling fingers. A photo of a brown-haired, green-eyed woman stared back, and there was a sadness in her eyes that made Sophie's heart ache. "Does she know you found her?" Sophie asked. Mike shook his head. "Not yet. I figured you'd want to decide how to proceed." Paul leaned forward, studying the photo. "She looks sad," he murmured. "I dug up a few more details," Mike continued. "Around the time the twins were born, Anne was going through a rough patch. Her father had recently died, leaving significant debts. She was about to lose the family home." Sophie felt a wave of compassion. "So that's why she abandoned them? Financial problems?" Mike hesitated. "Not exactly. There's more. Anne had a brother, David, who got tangled up with dangerous people. By the time she found out she was pregnant, David had already been missing for months. She was terrified those people might come after her and the babies." Paul closed his eyes, guilt consuming him. If he hadn't run away that morning, if he'd stayed and helped. "What do we do now?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Paul took a deep breath. "I think we need to find her. For Thomas and Claire. They deserve the truth. And maybe Anne needs it too." Sophie nodded slowly. "I agree. But how do we approach this? We can't just show up on her doorstep." After more discussion with Mike, they decided to send Anne a letter, explaining the situation and asking to meet. Waiting for her response was agonizing. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Anne agreed to meet them at a neutral cafe in the town where she lived. The night before the meeting, Paul and Sophie gathered at her house to talk about how it might go. "What if she wants to be part of their lives now?" Sophie asked, voicing her biggest worry at last. Paul took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Sophie, you're their mother. Nothing will change that. Nothing. But I think having Anne in their lives, in some way, could be good for them." Sophie nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. It's just hard." "We're in this together," Paul assured her. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it as a team." The next morning, they made the drive in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cafe was small and cozy, overlooking the sea. Anne was already there when they arrived, sitting at a corner table, hands trembling around a cup of tea. When she saw them, she stood up, her face a mix of fear and hope. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Anne, or Sarah, as they call me now." Paul felt his heart clench. She seemed so fragile, so different from the vibrant woman he'd met 6 years ago. "Anne," he said, offering his hand. "I'm Paul, and this is Sophie." They sat down, an uncomfortable silence hovering over the table. How are they?" Anne finally asked, her voice barely audible. Sophie offered a gentle smile. "They're wonderful. Thomas is brilliant. He loves dinosaurs and always asks questions about everything. Claire is our little artist, fearless and full of life. Anne stifled a sob. I'm so sorry, she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. I never wanted to abandon them. But at the time, I was so scared. Paul leaned forward. Anne, we're not here to judge you. We want to understand, and maybe find a way to move forward. Anne nodded, wiping her eyes. She began telling her story, constant fear, threats, the painful decision to leave the babies where she knew they'd be safe. I watched the hospital for days, she admitted. I wanted to make sure they'd be found quickly. When I saw the nurse pick them up, it was the hardest moment of my life. Sophie reached out, gently touching Anne's arm. You did what you thought you had to do to protect them. They talked for hours, sharing stories, photos, and eventually, even laughter. By the time they were ready to leave, they were all emotionally drained but somehow lighter. What happens now? Anne asked hesitantly. Paul and Sophie exchanged glances. We'd like you to be part of their lives, Sophie said. Maybe we can take it slow. Letters, photos, and when the time is right, a meeting. Tears of gratitude shone in Anne's eyes. I'd love that. Thank you, sir, for being so understanding. On the drive back, Paul and Sophie reflected on the meeting. I think we did the right thing, Paul said softly. Sophie agreed. Yes, they deserve to know where they came from, and Anne deserves a chance to know them. The future still held uncertainties, but it now felt full of possibilities. The family they had built was expanding in unexpected ways, and though challenges lay ahead, there was also hope, a lot of hope. The cafe was nearly empty when Anne walked in, her nervous gaze scanning the place until she spotted Paul and Sophie. They'd agreed to a second meeting, this time to discuss how Anne might be introduced to the twins. Hi, Anne said softly, sitting down. Her hands shook slightly as she placed them on the table. Sophie noticed Anne's tension immediately. Is everything all right? She asked, concerned. Anne took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears. Before we talk about anything involving the kids, there's something you both need to know. Something that will change everything. Paul and Sophie exchanged anxious looks. What I'm about to tell you is classified, Anne began, her voice low and intense. 6 years ago, I wasn't just Anne Dubois, an art teacher. I was Agent Dubois, part of an elite international intelligence unit. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. Agent, Sophie managed to say, incredulous. Anne nodded gravely. I was in the middle of a long-term undercover operation to infiltrate a global criminal organization. The night I spent with Paul, she looked at him with a mix of sadness and regret, was a lapse in judgment. I was overwhelmed, lonely, and for one night, I wanted to forget who I was. Paul felt a rush of conflicting emotions, shock, confusion, even a flicker of anger. Why didn't you tell me anything? I couldn't, Anne replied, pain evident in her voice. My mission was crucial. Lives were at stake. Sophie, still trying to process the news, asked, and the twins, leaving them? Anne closed her eyes, clearly struggling to hold back tears. When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. My cover was at risk, and worse, the children's lives would be in constant danger. The organization I was investigating wouldn't hesitate to use babies as leverage. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Abandoning them was the hardest decision I ever made. But I knew it was the only way to keep them safe. The cafe fell silent, only the faint clink of cups in the background as they all absorbed the shocking revelations. Why are you telling us this now? Paul asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Because the operation is finally over, Anne explained. The organization was dismantled. I can finally come out of hiding, be just Anne again. Sophie, who had remained quiet, processing it all, finally spoke. What does that mean for Thomas and Claire? For all of us. Anne looked straight into Sophie's eyes, her expression a mix of hope and fear. I know I have no right to ask this, but I want to be part of their lives. Not to replace you, Sophie. You are their mother in every way that matters. But maybe there's room for me, too. The silence was tense, filled with conflicting emotions. Paul was the first to speak. Anne, what you did Protecting the kids like this was incredibly brave. But Sophie raised Thomas and Claire. She's their mum. Sophie felt tears in her eyes, grateful for Paul's support but also feeling an unexpected compassion for Anne. "It's complicated," she said softly. "They're still so young." Anne nodded, understanding. "I know. I'm not asking to barge into their lives. I just want the chance to know them eventually, somehow." The tension was palpable. Anne's biological rights clashed with the deep emotional bond Sophie and the children shared. The shocking truth about Anne's past mission added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. After a long moment of silence, Anne made a surprising proposal. What if I moved closer to you? Not to interfere, but to be nearby. We could introduce me gradually, maybe as a family friend at first. Over time, when they're older and can handle it, we tell them the truth." Paul and Sophie exchanged glances, having a silent conversation with their eyes. "That's a bold idea," Paul said at last. Sophie added, her voice shaky but firm, "We'd need clear boundaries. Thomas and Claire's stability and well-being have to come first." Anne nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I'll follow your lead. I just want a chance to be in their lives. Somehow." The air was thick with possibilities and apprehension. This decision would alter the course of their lives forever. "We need time to think," Sophie finally said. "To talk it over and figure out what's best for the children?" Paul agreed. "This isn't a decision we can make on the spot. There's too much at stake." Anne looked relieved, even without a definitive answer. "I understand, and thank you for even considering it. Whatever you decide, I'm grateful you took such good care of Thomas and Claire." As they parted ways, the future felt more uncertain than ever. Paul and Sophie left the cafe hand in hand, both lost in thoughts about how these revelations would affect their newly formed family. Anne's confessions had unearthed secrets no one could have predicted, casting a new light on the twins' abandonment and adding complexity to a situation that was already delicate. Walking in silence, Paul and Sophie both knew they faced a monumental decision, one that wouldn't just affect their lives, but would shape Thomas and Claire's future in ways they could barely imagine. The autumn sun bathed the park in golden light, leaves gently falling around the group gathered beneath a large oak tree. Paul, Bay, Sophie and Anne sat on a bench, watching Thomas and Claire play happily with other kids. It was the twins' 6th birthday, and also the day that would change their lives forever. In the weeks following Anne's revelation, there had been countless discussions, tears and moments of doubt, but at last, they reached a decision. Paul cleared his throat, calling everyone's attention. "Thomas, Claire, can you come over here for a minute?" The children dashed over, their cheeks flushed with excitement. Sophie smiled, pulling them into a hug. "Remember when we talked about different kinds of families?" Sophie began gently. Thomas nodded seriously. "Like Billy in my class, who has 2 dads." "Exactly," Paul said with a smile. "Well, our family is about to get a little different too." Claire glanced curiously at Anne. "Is that why Auntie Anne is here?" Anne felt her heart clench at the affectionate nickname the twins had begun using for her in recent weeks. Sophie took a deep breath. "Yes, honey. You see, Auntie Anne, she's very special to you. She's the mummy who gave birth to you." The twins' eyes went wide with surprise. "But you're our mum," Thomas said, confused. "I always will be," Sophie assured him, pulling him close. "But Anne loves you both very, very much too, and she wants to be part of our family if you want her to." Anne knelt down in front of them, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry I wasn't here before. I wanted to be, but I had a very important, very dangerous job. I had to leave so you'd stay safe." "Like a secret superhero?" Claire asked, her eyes gleaming. Anne laughed softly. "Something like that, yes." Paul joined them, placing a hand on each child's shoulder. "We thought maybe we could be one big family. One mom, one dad, and, well, whatever you'd like to call Anne." The kids thought for a moment. Thomas spoke first. "How about Mama Anne?" Tears rolled freely down Anne's cheeks now. "I'd love that," she whispered. Claire, always impulsive, flung herself into Anne's arms. "Now we have 2 moms and a dad." The children's laughter rang through the park, easing the tension of the moment. Sophie, Paul, and Anne exchanged looks of relief and hope. Later, as the children enjoyed birthday cake with their friends, the adults had a moment to reflect. "It won't be easy," Paul said, watching the happy scene before them. Sophie nodded. "But it's worth it. For them." Anne looked at them both with gratitude. "I can never thank you enough for giving me this second chance." The next day, Paul held a press conference. Holding Sophie's hand with Anne at his side, he faced the cameras. "6 years ago, I made a mistake that, ironically, resulted in the two greatest blessings of my life," he began, his voice steady. "Today, I'm here to publicly acknowledge my paternity of two incredible twins, Thomas and Claire." The room erupted in questions, camera flashes everywhere. Paul continued, explaining the unique situation of his family, praising Sophie as the incredible mother she was, and asking for respect and privacy as they navigated their new reality. In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. Paul dealt with media scrutiny and some professional setbacks, but his determination to be a good father never wavered. Sophie, with the help of therapy, worked through her fears and insecurities, learning to share the twins' love without feeling threatened. Anne found her own form of redemption. She moved closer, starting fresh as an art teacher. Slowly, she built a relationship with Thomas and Claire, always respecting the boundaries set by Sophie and Paul. 1 year later, on the twins' 7th birthday, the unconventional family gathered again in the same park. The air was full of laughter, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy. Thomas ran over to Paul, holding up a drawing. "Look, Dad, I drew our family." Paul studied the picture, his heart swelling with emotion. There were 5 stick figures smiling. Mom, Dad, Mama Anne, Thomas, and Claire. "It's perfect, buddy," Paul said, pulling his son into a hug. Later, as the children played, Sophie, Paul, and Anne sat together, watching the scene. "Who would have thought we'd be here a year ago?" Sophie mused, smiling. Paul squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for your courage, for giving us a chance." Anne nodded, visibly moved. "You both taught me the true meaning of family. It's not about blood or titles, it's about love and choice." They watched in silence as Thomas helped Claire climb on a piece of playground equipment, both of them laughing. "They look so happy," Sophie murmured. "And safe," Anne added. "That's all I ever wanted for them." Paul smiled, feeling a peace he never imagined possible. "I think we've all found our redemption, in a way. Second chances, new beginnings." The children ran back, throwing themselves into the adults' arms. "This is the best birthday ever," Claire exclaimed. Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "We're so lucky. We have so many people who love us." The adults exchanged emotional glances, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The past, with all its complications and pain, finally seemed resolved. The future, though still uncertain, shone with promise and hope. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the unconventional family hugged one another, forming a circle of love and acceptance. They had learned that forgiveness was possible, that love could overcome the hardest obstacles, and that family, in the end, was what they chose to make of it. And in that moment, under the twilight sky, with children's laughter echoing around them, they knew they had made the right choice.